Getting your scene set up for character modeling is pretty important because character modeling is a long and intensive process, but it's also one that can be made easier if you take time to set up your workspace properly. So just a couple of things that I wanted to share in this video. The first of which is getting your viewport set up in kind of a quad view. Now, we haven't used that as much in the previous videos, but it's certainly common for many 3D modelers to work their entire modeling workflow in a what's called a quad or a 4 views template like we see here. So for the most part, we've been looking at it this way. We've done perspective view. Holding Control, Alt, and pressing Q switches between your perspective view and the quad view. Now, we also can hit Command Alt Q if you're on a Mac for what it's worth. Now, the quad view shows our perspective just like we had before, but it also gives us our top, front, and right orthographic views, which are very helpful when you're doing things like complex character modeling. You know, it's something where just seeing the top view of an object or the front, or having just kind of these flat views, can help you access points more easily, perhaps faces, etc. So Alt, Control, Q to pop back and forth between those views. Now, if it's not something where you want to use a 4 views, or perhaps you have you're working on a laptop and you don't have a whole lot of screen real estate, you can also access these views using the numpad. So that's the right side of your keyboard. So that's the 1, the 3, the 7, and the 9. That'll switch through front, right, top, and bottom. Now, I realize that on laptops or some of these smaller screens, you may not have the num keys. So you can still switch these views by hitting these different gizmo areas up in the top right hand corner. Also, your perspective views, the center keys of your numpad, so that's the 4, 5, 6, the 8, and the 2. As you're looking down on it, you can see that that's kind of the center crosshairs there. That'll page you through, for lack of a better word, or step you through moving along those 2 key axes. So the x-axis, and then I would assume the y for Blender, Z, and many other 3D software. So that way you can just kind of make sense of the different views that you've got. Once you get into complicated characters, this is going to be very helpful and important to practice, practice, practice. Or if you prefer, Command or Control Alt Q, and it pops you into your quad view. Now, working again from characters, it may be a little bit more complicated to model your object against a character or a design that you have, you know, as an image perhaps. So Blender affords you the ability to import images into your scene so that you can use them as tracing images of sorts. Now, you can simply drag and drop from your desktop and drop one into any of these views, believe it or not, and it'll create the image as an object in your scene. However, just to show the interface method, as I always say, there's multiple ways to get the same thing done. If you go to Add, where we've been getting meshes and other things like that, you can also add an image. So I can add a reference image or a background image. Both of them generally do the same thing. Background will sit behind. Reference will allow you to have this kind of more movable between objects. This background will sit behind objects forever. So let me show you what those do. Reference image. I'm going to go to 3D modeling, and I'm going to grab Lax. Lax comes from Dumb Ways to Die. It's an Australian safety campaign. You might be familiar. But they're kind of bean-like objects, all these characters. So I'm going to load that reference image, and you can see that Lax was added to my scene as an empty image object. I can see the image there, loaded in that image with no problem. The reason this may be helpful is because this image actually exists in your scene. You can move it backwards and forwards. You can set it at an angle or whatever you'd like. So it's a case where this image can be kind of manipulated. It can be scaled as well very easily. So reference images may be useful to you. And then it's also located in the right-hand side of your organizer up here, up in that chooser. So that means that we can get into the scale settings, the image property settings, etc. down below. And we can do things like scale that, move that, and so forth. There is those properties there. So that is the reference image. Now, one thing about these reference images, sometimes we can accidentally select them and they can kind of get in the way, get frustrating. So up in the top right hand corner, you can actually lock this image, but it's not accessible by default. We need to go to our filter settings and we need to add the selectable toggle. And once we do that, we can then turn this object off, which will allow us to manipulate our cube and do all kinds of things without actually selecting our reference image. So that's something I would recommend really as part of your default Blender workflow at this point. The last thing I'll mention is working in X-ray mode. So as I get into my scene and I get into edit mode and I start to pull and push and move points around, I can move them around and really try to get my cube to look a little bit like this lax character, etc. However, I can't really see through this cube, so it's kind of harder to position it over my character. So there's a few options that we have. We can go to wireframe shading, which is okay. It allows me to see where the wireframe is, but if I get really complicated images as tracing images or as references, it might be hard to see the dots, the points, and get a sense of where my wireframe actually is. So instead of wireframe, we can choose the X-ray mode, which is right next to wireframe. And when I do that, it's going to make my shape slightly transparent. And that allows me to see a combination of the polygons and the wireframe at the same time. So I highly recommend this X-ray mode. You can Alt-Z to do that as well. Last is you may prefer to take this empty object and you may want to just lower its transparency. And to do that, select your empty image object. Make sure that you're in object mode. That can be sometimes an issue. Make sure your object is selectable, which can sometimes be an issue if you've disabled selection. Make sure it's selected. And then you come down to the image tab and you can check the opacity box. And this allows you just to drop the opacity of your tracing image. You can lock that one up again. And that way we might not have as much need for, I'll restate, it may be easier to use our wireframe mode if our image reference is not as opaque. So just a few things that'll help you make the most of character modeling in Blender.